Welcome to our deep dive all about debugging. We're going to crack open debugging, a developer's detective guide to, help everybody turn those late night coding struggles into those aha moments.
Yeah, it's like having like a super seasoned detective right there with you, ready to tackle those code mysteries.
That's a great way to put it. And
Ah.
you know what I love about this guide? It's for, well, like everybody. It doesn't matter if you're just starting out or if you've, been coding for years. There are tips in here for everyone.
Oh, for sure. And one thing it really stresses is like mastering the basics,
You're
you
going to
know?
this.
Oh, and like how often the simplest thing like really trip us up. It's crazy. Like the guide actually suggests this technique. It's called rubber duck debugging. Have you heard of that?
It rings a bell, but remind me, what is that?
Okay, so it's this idea that you explain your code like line by line, but you're explaining it to something that can't talk back, like a rubber duck.
Oh, right. Okay.
And just the act of saying it out loud can help you spot like super obvious errors. You know, the ones you might miss if you're just like scanning the code.
Right, right. I mean, that makes sense. It's so easy to get like tunnel vision when you've been staring at the screen for too long.
Totally. And speaking of simple errors, the guide says like something like 80% of bugs are these like really basic ones.
80%. Wow, that's huge.
Yeah, like typos or like assigning a variable to the wrong thing or forgetting like a semicolon. You know, those tiny things can create a whole bunch of problems.
Oh, yeah. It's like that classic username versus username typo. Ugh, I can't tell you how many times I've done that one. And you waste so much time on something so tiny.
I know, right? So that's why the guide really emphasizes, slowing down, really looking at your code and writing test cases, if
Yeah.
possible.
Test cases.
Yeah, because it's like setting a mousetrap. You're kind of predicting where that bug might show up and creating this like trap to catch it before it can do any real damage.
I like that analogy. That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah.
So yeah, starting with the basics, taking it slow, trying things like rubber duck debugging. These are all great tips to save us a ton of frustration later on.
Definitely. And, when you do run into those more complex bugs, having that solid foundation in the basics, well, that makes a huge difference in how you'll tackle it.
For sure. And, the guide also talks about all these different debugging tools. It's like having a detective's gadget collection. Like, it starts by recommending the IDE debugger, especially for, newer developers. It says it's like your trusty sidekick helping you step through the code, looking for clues.
Oh, yeah, the IDE debugger is great. It's like having a magnifying glass. You can zoom in on each part of the puzzle. You can set these breakpoints, which basically pause the code, and then you can, go line by line and see how things are changing.
So you're not just reading the code, you're actually, like, seeing it happen.
Exactly. And, most debuggers, they let you look at the call stack, too. It's like following a trail of breadcrumbs. You can see how you got to a specific spot in the code, which can help you figure out, like, the chain of events that caused the bug.
That makes sense. Now, what about when you need a more direct approach, like you're trying to track down a specific value or see how things are flowing through a function? What does the guide recommend for that?
So for that, console.log can be really helpful. It's kind of like sending a little message from your code to the console. You get a peek into what's going on at that moment.
So it's like putting a tracker on a suspect. You're following their movements and gathering information.
Exactly. And it's super useful for like JavaScript or web dev. You can see those messages right there in your browser's console.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like a quick and easy way to get some insight without having to go through a whole big debugging setup.
Exactly. And then, as you get more comfortable debugging, the guide suggests exploring some more advanced tools like profilers.
Profilers. I remember that word from earlier. They sounded kind of intimidating. Can you explain what they do and why they're so useful?
Yeah. So profilers, they're like performance detectives for your code. They analyze how everything's running. They can pinpoint bottlenecks. They show you where your code is spending way too much time.
So if my code is running really slow, a profiler can help me figure out like why it's being so sluggish and then tell me where I need to optimize things.
Exactly. It's like a doctor running tests to diagnose a problem. Profilers collect data on your code's performance and then present in a way that's like easy to understand so you can see where the problems are.
That's helpful. Are there different kinds of profilers, like for different types of code or problems?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are some that focus on front-end performance, like how fast your website's loading and rendering, and they can pinpoint areas where things are slowing down. And then there are others for back-end code. They help you track down those bottlenecks in, like, your server-side logic.
Okay. I remember the guide mentioned some tools, like Chrome dev tools for front end and then was it Python's C profile for backend? So it sounds like there's a whole bunch of profilers out there to choose from.
There really are. And like which one you use kind of depends on, what kind of code you're working with and the specific performance issues you're trying to solve.
Right. What about logs? The guide talks about using server logs, like an archaeologist digging for clues. When would you use logs for debugging?
Oh, logs are so valuable. They're like a written record of everything your application is doing. They're really helpful for understanding what happened right before a bug, especially with like server-side stuff or really complex systems.
Okay, so if like something crashes on the server, logs can tell you what happened leading up to that crash.
Yes, like which functions were called, what data was processed, if there were any errors. It's like having a black box for your code.
That's super helpful, especially for those moments when you're just like, what in the world just happened?
Exactly. And you know what? The guide says logs become even more important when you're dealing with those big distributed systems.
Okay, like with microservices.
Yeah, you have all these different parts working together, and the logs can help you trace like a request as it moves through the system so you can see exactly where things might have gone wrong.
So it's kind of like connecting the dots. You can see how all the pieces are talking to each other.
Yeah, exactly. And for anyone who's managing systems like that, the guide recommends looking into tools like New Relic or Datadog. They're specifically designed for monitoring and troubleshooting these big distributed applications.
Those sound like serious tools, like for the big leagues.
They are, but they're so powerful. They let you track those requests, identify bottlenecks, and you get this complete view of how your app is doing. It's almost like having X-ray vision.
Wow. So it sounds like the guide is really encouraging developers at every level to like keep adding to their debugging toolkit and to try out new tools as as their projects get more complex.
Oh, for sure. Like, the world of debugging tools is always changing. There's always something new to learn and experiment with. The important thing is to be curious, try different things, and find what works best for you. Find your own debugging style.
Okay. So finding your own style, that's interesting. And speaking of style, the last part of the guide focuses on the mindset of like a master debugger. I'm super curious about that. What are the mental habits that set the really good debuggers apart from everyone else?
That's where things get really interesting. We'll talk about like channeling your inner Sherlock Holmes or even MacGyver. Are you ready to tap into your inner detective?
I am ready. Let's crack this case. Okay, so we've talked about, those really important basics and staying calm when things get a little stressful. Now, I want to dive into that detective toolkit, the essential debugging tools, the stuff that can help us solve, like even those crazy code mysteries.
Yeah, yeah. The guide starts with the IDE debugger, right? And it calls it like a junior developer's best friend. It's like having a sidekick who can help you figure out like what's actually happening inside your code.
Okay, so for someone who's, pretty new to all of this debugging stuff,
Mhm.
how would you explain, like, what makes the IDE debugger so powerful? I feel like it can be a little scary at first, right?
Oh yeah, totally. But it's all about visibility. It's like imagine your code is a movie and the debugger lets you like pause that movie at any point and then you can zoom in and examine every little detail.
Okay, got it.
So you can set these things called breakpoints and those are like pausing the movie, right? At a specific frame. And then you can walk through the code line by line and you can actually watch the values of your variables change as you go.
So you're not just reading the code anymore, you're actually seeing it in action and how each, like, step impacts the whole thing.
Yeah, exactly. And most debuggers will even let you check out the call stack. And it's kind of like seeing those breadcrumbs of how you ended up at that point in the code.
Right.
It's really helpful for like tracing your steps back and understanding what led to the bug.
Makes sense. Now, the guide also mentions console.log as this, like, really simple but powerful tool. When would you use console.log instead of the IDE debugger?
Oh, so console.log, that's like sending a quick message from your code right to the console so you can get like a snapshot of what's going on at that exact moment.
Okay.
So it's great for like, checking what a variable is, making sure a function's being called, or understanding like how the logic's flowing in a block of code.
So it's like having a little spy inside your code reporting back to you.
Exactly. And it's super useful when you're, doing JavaScript or web development stuff because you can see those messages like right in the browser's console.
Right, right. Okay, so it's like a quick and dirty way to get a little insight without having to set up that whole, debugging session.
Exactly. And then as you kind of level up your debugging skills, the guide suggests checking out some of the more advanced tools like
Oh
profilers.
yeah, profilers. Remember we talked about those
Uh,
before. They sounded a little intense.
mhm.
Can you break down like what a profiler actually does and why it's so useful?
Oh, for sure. So profilers they're like those performance detectives for your code. They dig in and analyze how your code is running, and they can find those bottlenecks and show you where your code is just like spending way too much time.
Okay, so like if my code is running super slow, a profiler can help me figure out why it's being so sluggish and then tell me like where I should focus on making things faster.
Exactly. Like imagine a doctor running tests to figure out what's wrong with you. Profilers, they collect all this data on how your code's performing and then they like lay it all out so you can see where the problems are.
That's really helpful. Are there different types of profilers? Like, I don't know, for different kinds of code or different problems?
Yeah, absolutely. Like some are really good at front end performance, like how fast your website's loading, how it's rendering. They can show you like exactly where things are getting bogged down. And then
Oh.
there are others that are designed for back end code. They help you track down those bottlenecks in your server side logic.
Okay, so I remember the guide mentioned some specific tools. Like it was Chrome Dev Tools for front end, right? And then Python C Profile for the back end stuff. So it sounds like there's like a whole world of profilers out there for us to explore.
Yeah, there really is. And the best one for you is going to depend on, what you're working with and what kind of issues you're trying to solve.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about logs? The guide talks about using server logs, like you're an archaeologist, uncovering ancient secrets. When would you use logs for debugging?
Oh, logs they're like gold. They're like
Yeah.
a written record of everything your application is doing. And they can be super helpful for like understanding what happened right before a bug popped up,
Yeah.
especially if you're working with server stuff or those really complicated systems.
So, like, if something goes wrong on the server, the logs can tell you what happened leading up to that crash.
Yep. Like they can tell you which functions were called, what data was processed, if there were any errors. It's like having a black box for your code.
Oh, that's so helpful,
Oh,
especially for those moments when you're like, what just happened?
exactly. And the guide says logs are like even more important when you're dealing with those really big distributed systems. Like with
Oh,
microservices.
right, with microservices.
Yeah, because you have all these different parts working together. And logs can help you trace a request as it goes through the system so you can see exactly where things might have gone wrong.
So it's like connecting the dots. You can see how all the different parts are interacting.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're managing these kinds of systems, the guide recommends looking into tools like New Relic or Datadog. Those are specifically made for monitoring and troubleshooting those really big distributed applications.
Okay, those sound like some really, really powerful tools,
Yeah,
like for the big leagues.
they are powerful, but they can do so much. They let you track requests, find bottlenecks, and you get this complete view of like how healthy your application is. It's like having X-ray vision into your entire system.
That's amazing. So it sounds like the guide is really encouraging developers at like all levels to keep adding to their debugging toolkit
Yep.
and to play around with new tools as their projects, get bigger and more complex.
No, absolutely. Like the world of debugging tools, it's always changing and evolving. There's always something new to learn and experiment with. The the most important thing is to stay curious. Try different approaches and just find what works best for you. Find your own debugging style.
Your own style. Okay. That's interesting. And speaking of style, that last section in the guide, it focuses on like the mindset of a master debugger. I'm super curious to hear about that. What are those mental habits that separate the really great debuggers from everyone else?
Oh, that's where it gets really interesting. We'll talk about channeling your inner Sherlock Holmes
Yeah.
or even your inner MacGyver. Are you ready to like tap into your inner detective?
I'm so ready. Let's crack the case. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from like those fundamental debugging techniques to, the more advanced tools and those high pressure situations we all end up facing. But now I really want to dig into this idea of like the mindset of a master debugger. Like what does the guide say about developing those like Sherlock Holmes level debugging skills.
Yeah, it makes a really interesting point. The guide emphasizes that debugging, it's not just a technical skill, like it's a way of thinking,
Yeah.
It's a problem-solving approach that you can actually use, well, not just for code, but for like anything in life.
Ooh, I like that. Like thinking like a debugger, even outside of
Yeah.
coding. So, what are some of the key traits that it highlights?
Well, it starts with curiosity. A master debugger, they aren't afraid to ask questions, to dig deeper, to really figure out how things work, like underneath the surface. They're
Mhm.
like explorers, venturing into like uncharted territory, always wanting to uncover the hidden stuff and find the root cause of the problem.
So it's about embracing that sense of exploration and not being afraid to really dig in.
Exactly. And being methodical, like a good debugger, they approach a problem with a plan. They break it down into smaller pieces, gather evidence, come up with ideas, and then rigorously test those ideas.
So it's like a mix of scientific method and classic detective work.
Exactly. And just like a detective, a master debugger, they never give up. They're persistent, even when they're stuck with those really stubborn bugs that just make no sense.
It's about having that grit, that determination to stick with it, even when it feels like you're hitting a wall.
Totally. And the guide also talks about how important it is to be adaptable and creative too. Because sometimes, you got to think outside the box, try things that are a little unconventional. You got to MacGyver your way to a solution.
I love that, like that
Yeah.
resourceful debugger piecing together solutions from whatever they can find.
Exactly. And last but not least, a master debugger is a fantastic communicator. They can explain these like complicated technical things in a way that everyone understands, other developers and even people who aren't technical.
So it's not just about like fixing the problem. It's also being able to like explain what you did and help other people understand how you got there.
Yeah, for sure. And the guide encourages developers to like share their debugging stories, the good and the bad. We can all learn from each other and make this whole debugging thing a little less, well, a little less painful.
It's that whole like we're in this together kind of thing. We can all benefit from hearing about each other's experiences. And speaking of sharing stories, the guide ends with a great question. It asks, what's your most memorable debugging story?
Oh, I love that. It reminds us that debugging is a journey. It's got challenges and discoveries and those moments where you just want to pull your hair out, but then you have those amazing aha moments and it's all worth it.
And those are the moments that you got to share with other people who get it.
Hmm.
So to everyone listening, we want to hear your debugging war stories.
Yes. Head over to the CodeSkill forums. Tell us about your triumphs. Tell us about your struggles. Connect with, other people who are going through the same thing.
Because at the end of the day, we're all like detectives in this huge world of code. And every single bug is a case waiting to be cracked.
So put on your detective hats, grab your debugging tools, and remember, no bug is too big or too small for a skilled developer to solve.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of debugging. We hope you enjoyed exploring all these tips and techniques and that debugger's mindset.
Happy debugging, everybody.
And until next time, keep those brains buzzing and those bugs vanishing.